Charles Lucky Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania November 24, 1897 to January 26, 1962, was an Italian-born gangster who operated mainly in the United States. Luciano started his criminal career in the 5 Points Gang and was instrumental in the development of the National Crime Syndicate. Luciano is considered the father of modern organized crime in the United States for the establishment of the Commission in 1931, after he abolished the boss of bosses title held by Salvatore Maranzano following the Castellammarese War. He was also the first official boss of the modern Genovese crime family. In 1936, Luciano was tried and convicted for compulsory prostitution and running a prostitution racket after years of investigation by District Attorney Thomas Dewey. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, but during World War II an agreement was struck with the Department of the Navy through his Jewish mob associate Meyer Lansky to provide naval intelligence. In 1946, for his alleged wartime cooperation, his sentence was commuted on the condition that he be deported to Italy. Early life. Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania on November 24, 1897, in Lercarafritti, Sicily, Italy. Luciano's parents, Antonio Lucania and Rosalia Caparelli, had 4 other children: Bartolomeo, born 1890, Giuseppe, born 1898, Filippa, born 1901, and Concetta. Luciano's father worked in a sulfur mine in Sicily. His father was very ambitious and persistent and eventually moving to the United States. In The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano, the mafia story in his own words, a purported semi-autobiography that was published after Luciano's death, Luciano described how his father always had a new Palermo-based steamship company calendar each year and would save money for the boat trip by keeping a jar under his bed. In April 1906, when Luciano was 8 years old, the family emigrated from Sicily to the United States. They settled in New York City in the borough of Manhattan on its Lower East Side, a popular destination for Italian immigrants. At age 14, Luciano dropped out of school and started a job delivering hats, earning $7 per week. However, after winning $244 in a dice game, Luciano quit his job and began earning money on the street. That same year, Luciano's parents sent him to the Brooklyn truancy school. As a teenager, Luciano started his own gang and was a member of the old 5 Points Gang. Unlike other street gangs, whose business was petty crime, Luciano offered protection to Jewish youngsters from Italian and Irish gangs for 10 cents per week. Luciano also met Meyer Lansky as a teenager, when Luciano attempted to extort Lansky for protection money on his walk home from school. Luciano respected the younger boy's defiant responses to his threats, and the two formed a lasting partnership. It is not clear how Luciano earned the nickname Lucky. It may have come from surviving a severe beating and throat slashing by 3 men in 1929 as the result of his refusal to work for another mob boss. The nickname may also be attributed to his gambling luck or to a simple mispronunciation of his last name. From 1916 to 1936, Luciano was arrested 25 times on charges including assault, illegal gambling, blackmail, and robbery, but spent no time in prison. It is also not clear how his surname came to be rendered Luciano. This too may have been the result of persistent misspellings by newspapers. Prohibition in the early 1920s. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution took effect, and Prohibition lasted until the amendment was repealed in 1933. 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution established the prohibition of alcohol in the United States. The amendment was proposed by Congress on December 18, 1917, and ratified by the requisite number of states on January 16, 1919. The 18th Amendment was repealed by the 21st Amendment on December 5, 1933. It is the only constitutional amendment in American history to be repealed. The 18th Amendment was the product of decades of efforts by the temperance movement, which held that a ban on the sale of alcohol would ameliorate poverty and other societal problems. The 18th Amendment declared the production, transport, and sale of intoxicating liquors illegal, although it did not outlaw the actual consumption of alcohol. Shortly after the amendment was ratified, Congress passed the Volstead Act to provide for the federal enforcement of prohibition. The Volstead Act declared that liquor, wine, and beer qualified as intoxicating liquors, and were therefore prohibited. Under the terms of the 18th Amendment, Prohibition began on January 17, 1920, 1 year after the amendment was ratified. Demand for alcohol naturally continued, and the resulting black market for alcoholic beverages provided criminals with an additional source of income. Although the 18th Amendment led to a decline in alcohol consumption in the United States, nationwide enforcement of prohibition proved difficult, particularly in cities. Alcohol smuggling, known as rum running or bootlegging, and illicit bars, speakeasies, became popular in many areas. Public sentiment began to turn against prohibition during the 1920s. In 1932, Democratic presidential nominee Franklin Roosevelt called for its repeal. By 1920, Luciano had met many future mafia leaders, including Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, his longtime friend and future business partner through the 5 Points Gang. That same year, Lower Manhattan gang boss Joe Masuria recruited Luciano as one of his gunmen. Around that same time, Luciano and his close associates started working for gambler Arnold the Brain Rothstein, who immediately saw the potential windfall from prohibition, and educated Luciano on running bootleg alcohol as a business. Luciano, Costello, and Genovese started their own bootlegging operation with financing from Rothstein. Rothstein served as a mentor for Luciano. Among other things, Rothstein taught him how to move in high society. In 1923, Luciano was caught in a sting selling heroin to undercover agents. Although he saw no jail time, being outed as a drug peddler damaged his reputation among his high-class associates and customers. To salvage his reputation, Luciano bought 200 expensive seats to the Jack Dempsey-Luis Firpo boxing match in the Bronx and distributed them to top gangsters and politicians. Rothstein then took Luciano on a shopping trip to Wanamaker's department store in Manhattan to buy expensive clothes for the fight. The strategy worked, and Luciano's reputation was saved. By 1925, Luciano was grossing over $12 million per year and made a personal income of about $4 million per year from running illegal gambling and bootlegging operations in New York that also extended into Philadelphia. Rise to power in the late 1920s. Luciano soon became a top aide in Joe Masuria's criminal organization. In contrast to Rothstein, Masuria was uneducated, with poor manners and limited managerial skills. By the late 1920s, Masuria's main rival was boss Salvatore Maranzano, who had come from Sicily to run the Castellammarese clan. After one of Masuria's lieutenants, Gaetano Reina, switched sides to Maranzano, Masuria ordered Luciano to arrange Reina's murder. After Reina was murdered on February 26, 1930, the rivalry between Masuria and Maranzano escalated into the bloody Castellammarese War. Luciano soon began cultivating ties with other younger mobsters, who had been born in Italy, but began their criminal careers in the United States, and chafed at their boss's conservatism. Luciano wanted to use lessons he learned from Rothstein to turn their gang activities into criminal empires. As the war progressed, this group came to include future mob leaders such as Costello, Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Joe Bonanno, Carlo Gambino, Joe Prophesy, Tommy Gagliano, and Tommy Lucchese. They believed that their boss's greed and conservatism were keeping them poor while the Irish and Jewish gangs got rich. Luciano's vision was to form a national crime syndicate in which the Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs could pool their resources and turn organized crime into a lucrative business for all, an organization he founded after a conference was hosted in Atlantic City by Luciano, Johnny Torrio, Lansky, and Costello in May 1929. In October 1929, Luciano was forced into a limousine at gunpoint by 3 men, beaten and stabbed, and strung up by his hands from a beam in a warehouse in Staten Island. He survived the ordeal, but was forever marked with a scar and droopy eye. The identity of his abductors was never established. When picked up by the police after the beating, Luciano said that he had no idea who did it. Power play. In early 1931, Luciano decided to eliminate Masuria. The war had been going poorly for Masuria, and Luciano saw an opportunity to switch allegiance. In a secret deal with Maranzano, Luciano agreed to engineer Masuria's death in return for receiving Masuria's rackets, and becoming Maranzano's second-in-command. Joe Adonis had joined the Masuria faction, and when Masuria heard about Luciano's betrayal, he approached Adonis about killing Luciano. However, Adonis instead warned Luciano about the murder plot. On April 15, 1931, Masuria was killed at Nuova Villa Tomorrow, a Coney Island restaurant in Brooklyn. While they played cards, Luciano allegedly excused himself to go to the bathroom, at which point gunmen, reportedly Anastasia, Genovese, Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, entered the restaurant. With Maranzano's blessing, Luciano took over Masuria's gang and became Maranzano's lieutenant, ending the Castellammarese War. With Masuria gone, Maranzano reorganized the Italian-American gangs in New York City into 5 families headed by Luciano, Prophesy, Gagliano, Vincent Mangano, and himself. Maranzano called a meeting of crime bosses in Wappingers Falls, New York, where he declared himself boss of all bosses. Maranzano also whittled down the rival families' rackets in favor of his own. Luciano appeared to accept these changes, but was merely biding his time before removing Maranzano. Although Maranzano was slightly more forward-thinking than Masuria, Luciano had come to believe that Maranzano was even more greedy and hidebound than Masuria had been. By September 1931, Maranzano realized Luciano was a threat and hired Vincent Mad Dog Call, an Irish gangster, to kill him. However, Lucchese alerted Luciano that he was marked for death. On September 10th, Maranzano ordered Luciano, Genovese and Costello to come to his office at the Helmsley Building in Manhattan. Convinced that Maranzano planned to murder them, Luciano decided to act first. He sent to Maranzano's office 4 Jewish gangsters, whose faces were unknown to Maranzano's people. They had been secured with the aid of Lansky and Siegel. Disguised as government agents, 2 of the gangsters disarmed Maranzano's bodyguards. The other 2, aided by Lucchese, who was there to point Maranzano out, stabbed the boss multiple times before shooting him. This assassination was the first of what would later be fabled as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, reorganizing Cosa Nostra and the Commission. With the death of Maranzano, Luciano became the dominant crime boss in the United States. His own crime family controlled lucrative criminal rackets in New York City, such as illegal gambling, extortion, bookmaking, loan sharking, and drug trafficking. Luciano became very influential in labor union activities and controlled the Manhattan waterfront, garbage hauling, construction, garment district businesses, and trucking. Although there would have been few objections had Luciano declared himself boss of all bosses, he abolished the title, believing the position created trouble between the families and made himself a target for another ambitious challenger. Instead, Luciano chose to quietly maintain control through the Commission by forging unofficial alliances with other bosses. Luciano elevated his most trusted Italian associates to high-level positions in what was now the Luciano crime family. Genovese became underboss, and Costello consigliere. Adonis, Michael Tritter, Mike Coppola, Anthony Strallo, Willie Moretti, and Anthony Carfano all served as capo regimes. Because Lansky and Siegel were non-Italians, neither man could hold official positions within any mafia family. However, Lansky was a top advisor to Luciano, and Siegel a trusted associate. Later in 1931, Luciano called a meeting in Chicago with various bosses, where he proposed a commission to serve as the governing body for organized crime, designed to settle all disputes and decide which families controlled which territories. The commission has been called Luciano's greatest innovation. Luciano's goals with the commission were to quietly maintain his own power over all the families, and to prevent future gang wars. The bosses approved the idea of the commission. In 1998, Time characterized Luciano as the criminal mastermind among the top 20 most influential builders and titans of the 20th century.